Okay, we'll try that. All right, I'm going to pick up where I left off. I'm going through Jane Austen's Persuasion. It says in the title, this is a blind read, so I'm discovering everything as I go along. And we are ready for Chapter 9, it looks like. Captain Wentworth was come to Kellynch as to a home, to stay as long as he liked, being as thoroughly the object of the Admiral's fraternal. I did not warm up at all. Oh well. Captain Wentworth was come to Kellynch as to a home, to stay as long as he liked, being as thoroughly the object of the Admiral's fraternal kindness as of his wife's. Turning down my monitor. Okay. He had intended, on first arriving, to proceed very soon into Shropshire? I'll try Shropshire. He had intended, on first arriving, to proceed very soon into Shropshire and visit the brothers settled in that country, but the attractions of Uppercross induced him to put this off. There was so much of friendliness and of flattery, and of everything most bewitching in his reception there. The old were so hospitable, the young so agreeable, that he could not but resolve to remain where he was, and take all the charms and perfections of Edward's wife upon credit a little longer. It was soon Uppercross with him almost every day. The Musgroves could hardly be more ready to invite than he to come, particularly in the morning, when he had no companion at home, for the Admiral and Mrs. Croft were generally out of doors together, interesting themselves in their new possessions, their grass and their sheep, and dawdling about in a way not endurable to a third person, or driving out in a gig, lately added to their establishment. We got a footnote, driving out in a gig. A light one-horse carriage suitable for 2 people. Okay. Is that really all 2 sentences? No wonder I had trouble breathing there. I'm going to try that again. It was soon Uppercross of him almost every day. The Musgroves could hardly be more ready to invite than he to come, particularly in the morning, when he had no companion at home, for the Admiral and Mrs. Croft were generally out of doors together, interesting themselves in their new possessions, their grass and their sheep, and dawdling about in a way not endurable to a third person, or driving out in a gig, lately added to their establishment. Hitherto there had been but one opinion of Captain Wentworth among the Musgroves and their dependencies. It was unvarying, warm admiration everywhere, but this intimate footing was not more than established when a certain Charles Hayter returned among them, to be a good deal disturbed by it, and to think Captain Wentworth very much in the way. Charles Hayter was the eldest of all the cousins, and a very amiable, pleasing young man, between whom and Henrietta there had been a considerable appearance of attachment previous to Captain Wentworth. I get why he's objecting now. Charles Hayter was the eldest of all the cousins, and a very amiable, pleasing young man, between whom and Henrietta there had been a considerable appearance of attachment previous to Captain Wentworth's introduction. He was in orders, and having a curacy in the neighborhood where residence was not required, lived at his father's house, only 2 miles from Uppercross. A short absence from home had left his fair one unguarded by his attentions at this critical period, when he came back, he had the pain of finding very altered manners, and of seeing Captain Wentworth. Not required. Residence was not required. The curate was not required to live in the parish, but this does not imply that he was an absentee cleric. Okay. Mrs. Musgrove and Mrs. Hayter were sisters. They had they had each had they had each had money. Okay. They had each had money, but their marriages had made a material difference in their degree of consequence. Mr. Hayter had some property of his own, but it was insignificant compared with Mr. Musgrove's. And while the Musgroves were in the first class of society in the country, and while the Musgroves were in the first class of society in the country, the Hayters would, from their parents' inferior, retired, and unpolished way of living, and their own defective education, have been hardly in any class at all, but for their connections with Uppercross. This eldest son, of course, expected, who had been chosen to be a scholar and a gentleman, and who was very superior in cultivation and manners to all the rest. The two families had always been on excellent terms, there being no pride on one side and no envy on the other, and only such a consciousness of superiority in the Miss Musgroves as made them pleased to improve their cousins. Charles' attentions to Henrietta had been observed by her father and mother without any disapprobation. It would not be a great match for her, but if Henrietta liked him, and Henrietta did seem to like him, Henrietta fully thought to herself, before Captain Wentworth came, but from that time cousin Charles had been very much forgotten. Which of the two sisters was preferred by Captain Wentworth was as yet quite doubtful, as far as Anne's observation reached. Henrietta was perhaps the prettiest, Louisa had the highest spirits, and she knew not now whether the more gentle or the more lively character were and she knew not now whether the more gentle or the more lively character were most likely to attract him. Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove, either from seeing little or from an entire confidence in the discretion of both their daughters and of all the young men who came near them, seemed to leave everything to take its chance. This was not the smallest appearance of solicitude or remark about them in the mansion house, but it was different at the cottage. The young couple there were more disposed to speculate and wonder, and Captain Wentworth had not been above 4 or 5 times in the Miss Musgrove's company, and Charles Hayter had just but reappeared. And Charles Hayter had but just reappeared when Anne had to listen to the opinions of her brother and sister as to which the one liked best. Charles gave it for Louisa, Mary for Henrietta, but quite agreeing that to have him marry either would be extremely delightful. Charles had never seen a pleasanter man in his life, and from what he had heard, and from what he had once heard, and from what he had once heard Captain Wentworth himself say, he was very sure he would not made less. Was very sure that he had not made less than £20,000 by the war. Here was a fortune at once, besides which there would be the chance of what might be done in any future war, and he was sure Captain Wentworth was as likely a man to distinguish himself as any other officer in the Navy. Oh, it would be a capital match for either of his sisters. Upon my word it would, replied Mary. Dear me, if he should rise to any great honors. Oh, that was all a quote. Oh. Okay, I might try that. Charles had never seen a pleasanter man in his life, and from what he had once heard from Captain Wentworth, and is it? I mean, it's kind of a quote, but it's more like a paraphrase. Charles had never seen a pleasanter man in his life, and from what he had once heard Captain Wentworth himself say, was very sure that he had not made less than £20,000 by the war. Here was a fortune at once, besides which there would be the chance of what might be done in any future war, and he was sure Captain Wentworth was as likely a man to distinguish himself as any officer in the Navy. Oh, it would be a capital match for either of his sisters. Of his sisters. There's quotation marks. Oh, it would be a capital match for either of his sisters. Upon my word it would, replied Mary. Dear me, if he should rise to any great honours, if he should ever be made a baronet, Lady Wentworth sounds very well. That would be a noble thing indeed for Henrietta. She would take place of me, and then she would take place of me then, and Henrietta would not dislike that. Sir Frederick and Lady Wentworth. It would be but a new creation, however, and I never think much of your new creations. You got a footnote on new creation. And take the place of me. A baronet's wife takes precedence over a baronet's daughter. And then new creations, see notes on chapter 1, 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'm not sure what that one's referring to. I'll just move on. Oh, that's probably referring to the preface sold at spoilers. Okay. It suited Mary best to think Henrietta the one preferred, on the very account of Charles Hayter, whose pretensions she wished to see put an end to. She looked down very decidedly upon the Hayters, and thought it be quite a misfortune to have the existing connection between the families renewed. Very sad for herself and her children. She thought it be quite a misfortune to have the existing connection between the families renewed. Very sad for herself and her children. Ah, okay. You know, said she, I cannot think him at all if it matched for Henrietta, in considering the alliances which the Musgroves have made. She has no right to throw herself away. I do not think any young woman has a right to make a choice that may be disagreeable and inconvenient to the principal part of her family, and be giving bad connections to those who have not been used to them. And pray, who is Charles Hayter? Nothing but a country curate, a most improper match for Miss Musgrove of Uppercross. Her husband, however, would not agree with her here, for besides having a regard for his cousin, Charles Hayter was an eldest son, and he saw things as an eldest son himself. Now you were talking nonsense, Mary, was therefore his answer. It would not be a great match for Henrietta, but Charles has a very fair chance, through the Spicers, of getting something from the bishop in the course of a year or two, and you will please to remember that he's the eldest son. Whenever my uncle dies, he steps into very pretty property. The estate at Winthrop is not less than 250 acres, besides the farm near Taunton, which is some of the best land in the country. I grant you that any of them but Charles would be a very shocking match for Henrietta, and indeed it could not be. He is the only one that could be possible. But he is a very good-natured, good sort of a fellow, and whenever Winthrop comes into his hands, he will make a different sort of place of it, and live in a very different sort of way, and with that property he will never be a contemptible man. Good freehold property. No, Henrietta. No. Henrietta might do worse than marry Charles Hayter, and if she was him, and Louisa can get Captain Wentworth, I shall be very well satisfied. Charles may say what he pleases, cried Mary to Anne as soon as he was out of the room, but it would be quite shocking to have Henrietta marry Charles Hayter, a very bad thing for her, and still worse for me, and therefore it is very much to be wished that Captain Wentworth may soon put him quite out of her head, and I have very little doubt that he has. She took hardly any notice of Charles Hayter yesterday. I wish you had been there to see her behavior. As to Captain Wentworth's liking Louisa as well as Henrietta, it is nonsense to say so, for he certainly does like Henrietta a great deal the best. But Charles is so positive. I wish you had been with us yesterday, for then you might have decided between us, and I am sure you would have thought as I did, unless you had been determined to give it against me. At dinner, Mr. Musgrove's had been the occasion. When when all these things should have been seen by Anne. But if she had stayed at home, under a mixed plea of a headache of her own, and some return of indisposition in little Charles, she had thought only of avoiding Captain Wentworth, but an escape from being appealed to as an umpire was now added to the advantage of the quiet evening. Oh. She had thought only of avoiding Captain Wentworth, but an escape from being appealed to as an umpire was now added to the advantages of a quiet evening. As to Captain Wentworth's views, she deemed it of more consequence that he should know his own mind early enough not to be endangering the happiness of either sister or impeaching his own honor, than that he should prefer Henrietta to Louisa or Louisa to Henrietta. Either of them would, in all probability, make him an affectionate, good-humored wife. With regard to Charles Hayter, she had delicacy which must be pained by any lightness of conduct in a well-meaning young woman, and a heart to sympathize in any of the sufferings it occasioned. But if Henrietta found herself mistaken in the nature of her feelings, the alteration could not be understood too soon. Charles Hayter had met with much to disquiet and mortify him in his cousin's behavior. She had too old a regard for him to be so wholly estranged, as might in two meetings extinguish every past hope, and leave him nothing to do but to keep away from Uppercross. But there was such a change as became very alarming. Can I try that one again? Charles Hayter had met with much to disquiet and mortify him in his cousin's behavior. She had too old a regard for him to be so wholly estranged, as might in two meetings extinguish every past hope, and leave him nothing to do but to keep away from Uppercross. But there was such a change as became very alarming, when such a man as Captain Wentworth was to be regarded as the probable cause. He had been absent only 2 Sundays when they parted. He had been absent only 2 Sundays, and when they parted, had left her interested even to the height of his wishes, in his prospect of soon quitting his present curacy and obtaining that of Uppercross instead. It had then seemed the object nearest to her heart that Dr. Shirley, the rector, who for more than 40 years had been zealously discharging all the duties of his office, but was now growing too infirm for many of them, should be quite fixed on engaging a curate, and should make his curacy quite as good as he could afford, and should give Charles Hayter the promise of it. The advantage of his having to come only to Uppercross, instead of going 6 miles another way, of his having, in every respect, a better curacy, of his belonging to their dear Dr. Shirley, and of dear, good Dr. Shirley's being relieved from the duty which he could no longer get through without most injurious fatigue. Ugh. The advantage of his having to come only to Uppercross, instead of going 6 miles another way, of his having, in every respect, a better curacy, of his belonging to their dear Dr. Shirley, and of dear good Dr. Shirley's being relieved from the duty which he could no longer get through without being most injurious. And of dear good Dr. Shirley's being relieved from the duty which he could no longer get through without most injurious fatigue, had been a great deal, even to Louisa, but had been almost everything to Henrietta. When he came back, alas, the zeal of the business was gone by. Louisa could not listen at all to his account of a conversation which he had just had with Dr. Shirley. She was at window, looking out for Captain Wentworth, and even Henrietta had at best and even Henrietta had at best only a divided attention to give, and seemed to have forgotten all the former doubt and solicitude of the negotiation. Well, I am very glad indeed, but I always thought you would have it. I always thought you sure. It did not appear to me that. In short, Dr. Shirley must have a curate, and you had secured his promise. Is he coming, Louisa? One morning, very soon after the dinner at the Musgroves, at which Anne had not been present, Captain Wentworth walked into the drawing room at the cottage, where were only herself and the little invalid Charles, who was lying on the sofa. The surprise of finding himself almost alone with Anne Elliot deprived his manners of their usual composure. He started, and could only say, "I thought the Miss Musgroves had been. I thought the Miss Musgroves had been here. Mrs. Musgrove told me I should find them here," before he walked to the window to recollect himself, and feel how he ought to behave. "They are upstairs with my sister. They'll be down in a few moments, I dare say," had been Anne's reply, in all the confusion that was natural. And if the child was not called, and if the child had not called her to come and do something for him, she would have been out of the room in the next. She would have been out of the room the next moment, and released Captain Wentworth as well as herself. He continued at the window, and after calmly and politely saying, "I hope the little boy is better," was silent. She was obliged to kneel down by the sofa, and remain there to satisfy her patient, and thus they continued a few minutes, when, to her very great satisfaction, she heard some other person crossing the little vestibule. She hoped, on turning her head, to see the master of the house, but it proved to be one much less calculated for making matters easier. Charles Hayter, probably not at all better pleased by the sight of Captain Wentworth than Captain Wentworth had been by the sight of Anne. She only attempted to say, "How do you do? Will you not sit down? The others will be here presently." Captain Wentworth, however, came from his window, apparently not ill-disposed for conversation, but Charles Hayter soon put an end to his attempts, by seating himself near the table and taking up the newspaper, and Captain Wentworth returned to his window. Another minute brought another addition. The younger boy, a remarkable stout forward child of 2 years old, having got the door opened for him by someone without. Having got the door opened for him by someone without, made his determined appearance among them, and went straight to the sofa to see what was going on, and put in his claim to anything good that might be giving away. There was nothing to be eat, but there was nothing to be eat. He could only have some play, and as his aunt would not let him tease his sick brother, he began to fasten himself upon her, as she knelt, in such a way that, busy as she was about Charles, she could not shake him off. She spoke to him, ordered, entreated, and insisted in vain. Once she did contrive to push away, but the boy had the greater pleasure in getting upon her back again directly. "Walter," said she, "get down this moment. You are extremely troublesome. I am very angry with you." "Walter," cried Charles Hayter, "why do you not do as you are bid? Do you not hear your aunt speak? Come to me, Walter. Come to cousin Charles." But not a bit did Walter stir. In another moment, however, she found herself in the state of being released from him. Someone was taking him from her, though he had bent forward her head so much that though he had bent down her head so much that his little sturdy hands were unfastened from around her neck, and he was resolutely borne away before she knew that Captain Wentworth had done it. Her sensations on the discovery made her perfectly speechless. She could not even thank him. She could only hang over little Charles, with most disordered feelings. His kindness in stepping forward to her relief, the manner, the silence in which it had passed, the little particulars of the circumstance, with a conviction soon forced on her by the noise with the conviction soon forced on her by the noise he was studiously making with the child that he meant to avoid hearing her thanks, and rather sought to testify that her conversation was the last of his wants, produced such a confusion of varying but very painful agitation as she could not recover from, till enabled by the entrance of Mary and the Miss Musgraves. To make over her little patient to their cares and leave the room. She could not stay. It might have been an opportunity of watching the loves and jealousies of the four. They were now all together, but she could not stay for none of it. It was evident that Charles Hayter was not well inclined towards Captain Wentworth. She had a strong impression of his having said, in a vexed tone of voice, after Captain Wentworth's interference, "You ought to have minded me, Walter. I told you not to tease your aunt," and could comprehend his regretting that Captain Wentworth should do what he ought to have done himself. But neither Charles Hayter's feelings, nor anybody's feelings, could interest her, till she had gotten a better till she had till she had a little better arranged her own. She was ashamed of herself, quite ashamed of being so nervous, so overcome by such a trifle. But so it was, and it required a long application of solitude and reflection to recover her. Chapter 10. Other opportunities of making her observations could not fail to occur. Anne had soon been in company with all the four together often enough to have an opinion, though too wise to acknowledge as much at home, when she knew it would have neither. And soon had been in company with all the four together often enough to have an opinion, though too wise to acknowledge as much at home, where she knew it would have satisfied neither husband nor wife, for while she considered Louisa to be rather the favorite, she could not but think, as far as she might dare, to judge from memory and experience, that Captain Wentworth was not in love with either. They were more in love with him, yet there it was not love. It was little fever of admiration, but it might, probably must, end in love with some. Charles Hayter seemed aware of being slighted, and yet Henrietta had sometimes the air of being divided between them. Anne longed for the power of representing to them all what they were about, and of pointing out some of the evils they were exposing themselves to. She did not attribute guile to any. It was the highest satisfaction to her to believe Captain Wentworth not in the least aware of the pain he was occasioning. There was no pitiful triumph in his manner. He had probably never heard and never thought of any claims of Charles Hayter. He was only wrong in accepting the attentions, for accepting must be the word, of two young women at once. After a short struggle, however, Charles Hayter seemed to quit the field. 3 days had passed since his coming once to Uppercross, a most decided change. He had even refused one regular invitation to dinner, and having been found on the occasion by Mr. Musgrove with some large books before him, Mr. and Mr. Musgrove were sure all could not be right, and talked, with grave faces, of his studying himself to death. It was Mary's hope and belief that he received a positive dismissal from Henrietta, and her husband lived under the constant dependence of seeing him tomorrow. Anne could only feel that Charles Hayter was wise. One morning, about this time, Charles Musgrove and Captain Wentworth, being gone a shooting together, as the sisters in the cottage were sitting quietly at work. One morning about this time, Charles Musgrove and Captain Wentworth were Charles Musgrove and Captain Wentworth being gone a shooting together, as the sisters in the cottage were sitting quietly at work. They were visited at the window by the sisters from the mansion house. It was now a very fine November day, and the Miss Musgroves came through the little grounds, and stopped for no other purpose than to say they were going to take a long walk, and therefore, concluded Mary not to like to go with them, and when Mary immediately replied, with some jealousy, and not being supposed a good walker, "Oh yes, I should like to join you very much. I am very fond of long walk. I am very fond of a long walk." Anne felt persuaded, by the looks of the two girls, that it was precisely what they did not wish, and admired again the sort of necessity which the family habits seemed to produce, of everything being of everything being to be of everything being to be communicated, and everything being to be done together, however undesired and inconvenient. She tried to dissuade Mary from going, but in vain, and that being the case, thought it best to accept the Miss Musgrove's much more cordial invitation to herself to go likewise, as she might be useful in turning back with her sister and lessening the interference in any plan of their own. "I cannot imagine why they should suppose I should not like a long walk," said Mary as she went up the stairs. "Everybody is always supposing that I am not a good walker, and yet they would not have been pleased and yet they would not have been pleased if we had refused to join them. When people come in this manner on purpose to ask us, how can one say no?" Just as they were setting off, the gentlemen returned. They had just taken out a young dog who had spoilt the sport and sent them back early. Their time and strength and spirits were, therefore, exactly ready for this walk, and they entered into it with pleasure. Could Anne have foreseen such a junction, she would have stayed at home. But for some feelings of interest and curiosity, she fancied now that it was too late to retract, and the whole six set forward together in the direction chosen by the Miss Musgroves, who evidently considered the walk as under their guidance. Anne's object was not to Anne's object was not to be in the way of anybody, and where the narrow paths across the fields made many separations necessary, to keep with her brother and sister. Her pleasure in the walk must arise from the exercise and the day, from the view of the last smiles of the year upon the tawny leaves and withered hedges, and from repeating to herself some few of the thousand poetical descriptions extant of autumn, that season of peculiar and inexhaustible influence on the mind of taste and tenderness, that season which is drawn from every poet worthy of being that season which is drawn from every poet worthy of being read, some attempt at description or some lines of feeling. She occupied her mind as possible she occupied her mind as much as possible in such like musings and she occupied her mind as much as possible in such like musings and Ugh. she occupied her mind She occupied her mind as much as possible in such like musings and questions, but it was not possible that when within reach of Captain Wentworth's conversation with either of the Miss Musgroves, she should not try to hear it. If she caught little very remarkable, if she caught little very remarkable, it was merely lively chat, such as any young persons on an intimate footing might fall into. He was more engaged with Louisa than Henrietta. Louisa certainly put more forward Louisa certainly put more forward for his notice than her sister. This distinction appeared to increase, and there was one speech of Louisa's which struck her. After one of the many praises of the day, which were continually bursting forth, Captain Wentworth added, "What glorious weather for the Admiral and my sister! They meant to take a long drive this morning. Perhaps we may hail them from some of these hills. They talked of coming into this side of the country. They talked of coming into this side of the country. I wonder whereabouts they will upset today. Oh, it does happen very often, I assure you, but my sister makes nothing of it. She would as lieve be tossed out of naught. What? Upset, overturn. Their two-wheel gig is unstable if driven hard. Then as leaf, as willingly occurring in the spelling until well into use. Huh. But my sister makes nothing of it. She would as she would as lief be tossed out of she would as lief be tossed out as not. Ah, you make the most of it, I know, cried Louisa. But if it were really so, I should do just the same in her place. Pooh. But if it were really so, I should do just the same in her place. If I loved a man as she loved the Admiral, I would be always with him. Nothing should ever separate us, and I would rather be overturned by him than driven safely by anybody else. It was spoken of such enthusiasm. Had you? Cried he, catching the same tone. I honor you. And there was a silence between them for a little while. Anne could not immediately fall into a quotation again. The sweet scenes of autumn were for a while put by, unless some tender sonnet, fraught with the apt analogy of the declining year, with declining happiness, and the images of youth and hope and spring, all gone together, blessed her memory. She roused herself to say, as they struck by order into another path, Is not this one of the ways to Winthrop? Winthrop. Is not this one of the ways to Winthrop? But nobody heard her, or at least nobody answered her. Winthrop, however, or its environs, for young men are sometimes to be met with strolling about near home, was their destination. And after another half mile of gradual ascent through large enclosures, where the ploughs at work and the fresh-made paths spoke the farmer, counteracting the sweets of poetical despondence, in meaning to have spring again, they gained the summit of the most considerable hill which parted Uppercross and Winthrop, and soon commanded a full view of the latter at the foot of the hill on the side of the view. At the foot of the hill on the other side. Winthrop, without beauty and without dignity, was stretched before them, an indifferent house, standing low, and hemmed in by the barns and buildings of a farmyard. Mary exclaimed, Bless me! Here is Winthrop! I declare I had no idea. Well, now I think we had better turn back. I am excessively tired. Henrietta, conscious and ashamed, and seeing no cousin Charles walking along any path or leaning against any gate, was ready to do as Mary wished. But no, cried Charles Musgrove, and no, no, cried Louisa more eagerly, and taking her sister aside, seemed to be arguing the matter warmly. Charles, in the meanwhile, was very decidedly declaring his resolution of calling on his aunt, but now that he was so near, and very evidently, though more fearfully, trying to induce his wife to go too. But this was one of the points in which the lady showed her strength, and when he recommended the advantage of resting herself a quarter of an hour at Winthrop, as she felt so tired, she resolutely answered, Oh, no indeed. Walking up that hill again would do more harm than any sitting down could do her good. And in short, her look and manner declared that she would not. After a little succession of these sort of debates and consultations, it was settled between Charles and his two sisters that he and Henrietta should just run down for a few minutes to see their aunts and cousins, while the rest of the party waited for them atop of the hill. While the rest of the party waited for them at the top of the hill. Louisa seemed the principal arranger of the plan, and as she went a little way with them down the hill, still talking to Henrietta, Mary took the opportunity of looking scornfully around her and saying to Captain Wentworth, "It is very unpleasant having such connections, but I assure you, I have never been in the house above twice in my life." She received no other answer than an artificial, assenting smile, followed by a contemptuous glance as he turned away, which Anne perfectly knew the meaning of. The brow of the hill, where they remained, was a cheerful spot. Ugh. The brow of the hill where they remained was a cheerful spot. Louisa returned, and Mary, finding a comfortable seat for herself on the step of a stile, was very well satisfied so long as the others all stood about her. But when Louisa drew Captain Wentworth away to try for a gleaning of nuts in an adjoining hedgerow, and they were gone by degrees quite out of sight and sound, Mary was happy no longer. She quarrelled with her own seat, was sure Louisa had gotten a much better somewhere, and nothing could prevent her from going to look for a better also. She turned through the same gate, but could not see them. Anne found a nice seat for her on a dry sunny bank under the hedgerow, in which she had no doubt of their still being in some spot or other. Mary sat down for a moment, but it would not do. She was sure Louisa had found a better seat somewhere else, and she would go on till she overtook her. Anne, really tired herself, was glad to sit down, and she very soon heard Captain Wentworth and Louisa in the hedgerow behind her, as if making their way back along the rough, wild sort of channel down the center. As if making their way back down the rough, wild sort of channel down the center. Let's try that again. Anne really was tired. Anne, really tired herself, was glad to sit down, and she very soon heard Captain Wentworth and Louisa in the hedgerow behind her, as if making their way back along the rough, wild sort of channel down the center. They were speaking as they drew near. Louisa's voice was the first distinguished. She seemed to be in the middle of some eager speech. What Anne first heard was, "And so I made her go. I could not bear that she should be frightened by I could not bear that she should be frightened from the visit by such nonsense. What? Would I be turned back from doing a thing which I had determined to do, and a, and that I knew to be right, by the airs and interference of such a person, or of any person I may say? No, I have no idea of being so easily persuaded. When I have made up my mind, I have made it. And Henrietta seemed entirely to have made up hers to call at Winthrop today, and yet she was as near giving it up out of nonsensical complacence. She was as near giving it up out of nonsensical complacence. She would have turned back then, but for you? She would indeed. I am almost ashamed to say it. Happy for her to have such a mind as yours at hand. After the hints you gave just now, which did but confirm my own observations the last time I was in company with him, I need not affect to have no comprehension of what is going on. I see that more than a mere dutiful morning visit to your aunt was in question, and will betide him, and her too, when it comes to things of consequence, when they are placed in circumstances requiring fortitude and strength of mind, if she have not a resolution enough to resist idle interference in such a trifle as this. Your sister is an amiable creature, but yours is the character of decision and firmness, I see. If you value her conduct or happiness, then infuse as much of your own spirit into her as you can. But this, no doubt, you have been always doing. It is the worst evil of too yielding and indecisive a character that no indifference over it can be depended on. You are never sure of a good impression being durable. Everybody may sway it, let those who would be happy be firm. Here is a nut, said he, catching one down from an upper bough. To exemplify, a beautiful glossy nut, which blessed with original strength has outlived all the storms of the autumn. Not a puncture, not a weak spot anywhere. This nut, he continued with playful solemnity, while so many of its brethren have fallen and been trodden under foot, is still in possession of all the happiness that a hazelnut can be supposed capable of. Then returning to his former earnest tone, my first wish for all, my first wish for all, whom I am, whom I am interested in, is that they should be firm. If Louisa Musgrove would be beautiful and happy in her November of life, she will cherish in all she will cherish all her present powers of mind. He had done, and was answered, and was unanswered. It would have been surprised It would have surprised Anne if Louisa could have readily answered such a speech, words of such interest, spoken with such serious warmth. She could imagine what Louisa was feeling. For herself, she feared to move lest she be seen. While she remained, a bush of low rambling holly protected her, and they were moving on. Before they were beyond her hearing, however, Louisa spoke again. Mary is good-natured enough in many respects, said she, but she does sometimes provoke me excessively by her nonsense and her pride, the Elliot pride. She has a great deal too much of the Elliot pride. We do so wish that Charles had married Anne instead. I suppose you know he wanted to marry Anne? After a moment's pause, Captain Wentworth said, Do you mean that she refused him? Oh, yes, certainly. When did that happen? I do not exactly know, for Henriette and I were at school at the time, but I believe about a year before he married Mary. I wish she had accepted him. We should all have liked her a great deal better, and Papa and Mamma always think it was her great friend Lady Russell's doing that she did not. They think Charles might not be learned and bookish enough to please Lady Russell, and that therefore she persuaded Anne to refuse him. The sounds were retreating, and Anne distinguished no more. Her own emotions she kept her own emo- her own emotions she kept her own emotions still kept her fixed. She had much to recover from before she could move. The listener's proverbial fate was not absolutely hers. She had heard no evil of herself, but she had heard a great deal of very painful import. She saw how her own character was considered by Captain Wentworth, and there had been just that degree of feeling and curiosity about her in his manner, which must give her extreme agitation. As soon as she could, she went after Mary, and having found, and walked back with her to their former station by the stile, felt some comfort in their whole party being immediately afterwards collected, and once more in motion together. Her spirits wanted the solitude and silence which only numbers could give. Oh, I relate that sentence so much. Wanting the solitude and silence that only numbers could give. I love that line. Okay. Charles and Henrietta returned, bringing, as may be conjectured, Charles Hayter with them. The minutiae of the business Anne could not attempt to understand. Even Captain Wentworth did not seem admitted to perfect confidence here, but that there had been only a withdrawing of the gentleman's side, and a relenting on the ladies, that they were now very glad to be together again, did not admit a doubt. Henrietta looked a little ashamed, but very well pleased. Charles Hayter exceedingly happy, and they were devoted to each other almost from the first instance of all their setting forward for Uppercross. And they were devoted to each other almost from the first instant of all their all setting forward for Uppercross. Gotcha. Charles Hayter exceedingly happy, and they were devoted to each other almost from the first instant of their all setting forward for Upper Cross. Everything now marked out Louisa for Captain Wentworth. Nothing could be plainer, and where many divisions were necessary, or when or even when they were not, they walked side by side, nearly as much as the other two. In a long strip of meadowland, where there was ample space for all, they were thus divided, forming three distinct parties, and to that party of the three which boasted least animation and least complacence, and, and necessarily belonged. She joined Charles and Mary, and was tired enough to be very glad of Charles' other arm. But Charles, though in very good humor with her, was out of temper with his wife. Mary had shown herself disobliging to him, and was now to reap the consequence, which consequence was his dropping her arm almost every moment to cut off the head of the to cut off the heads of some of the nettles in the to cut off the heads of some nettles in the hedge with a switch. And when Mary began to complain of it and lament her being ill used, according to custom, and being on the hedge still, while Anne was never incommoded, on the other, he dropped the arms of both to hunt after a weasel which he had made a momentary glance. He dropped the arms of both to hunt after a weasel which he had a momentary glance of, and they could hardly get him along at all. Oh, this sounds insufferable. This long meadow bordered a lane, which their footpath, at the end of it, was to cross, and when the party had all reached the gate of exit, the carriage advancing in the same direction, which had been some time heard, was just coming up, and proved to be the Admiral Croft's gig. He and his wife had taken their intended drive and were returning home. Upon hearing how long a walk the young people had engaged in, they kindly offered a seat to any lady who might be particularly tired. It would save her a full mile, and they were going through Upper Cross. The invitation was general and generally declined. The Miss Musgroves were not at all tired, and Mary was either offended by not being asked before any of the others, or what Louisa called the Elliot pride, could not endure to make a third in a one-horse chaise. The walking party had crossed the lane and were surmounting an opposite stile, and the Admiral was putting his horse into motion again when Captain Wentworth cleared the hedge in a moment to say something to his sister. The something might be guessed by its effects. "Miss Elliot, I'm sure you are tired," cried Mrs. Croft. "Do let us have the pleasure of taking you home. Here is excellent room for three, I assure you. If we were all like you, I believe we might sit four. You must, indeed, you must." Anne was still in the lane, and though instinctively beginning to decline, she was not allowed to proceed. The Admiral's kind urgency came in support of his wife's, and they would not be refused. They compressed themselves into the smallest possible space to leave her a corner, and Captain Wentworth, without saying a word, turned to her, and quietly obliged her to be assisted into the carriage. Yes, he had done it. She was in the carriage, and felt that he had placed her there, that his will in his hands had done it, that she owed it to his perception of her fatigue and his resolution to give her rest. She was very much affected by the view of his disposition toward her, which all these things made apparent. This little circumstance seemed the completion of all that had gone before. She understood him. He could not forgive her, but he could not be unfeeling. Though condemning her for the past, and considering it with high and unjust resentment, though perfectly careless of her, and though becoming attached to another, still he could not see her suffer without the desire of giving her relief. It was a reminder of her former sentiment, It was an impulse of pure, though unacknowledged friendship. It was an impulse of pure, though unacknowledged friendship. It was a proof of his own warm and amiable heart, which she could not contemplate without emotion so compounded of pleasure and pain, which she knew that she knew not which prevailed. Okay. Her answers to the kindness and the remarks of her companions were at first unconsciously given. They had traveled half their way along the rough lane before she was quite awake to what they said. She then found them talking of Frederick. "He certainly means to have one or other of those two girls, Sophie," said the Admiral, "but there is no saying which. He has been running after them, too, long enough, one would think, to make up his mind. Aye, this comes of the peace. If it were war, now, he would have settled it long ago. We sailors, Miss Elliot, cannot afford to make long courtships in time of war. How many days was it, my dear, between the first time of my seeing you and our sitting down together in our lodgings at North Yarmouth, and our sitting down together in our lodgings at North Yarmouth?" "We had better not talk about it, my dear," replied Mrs. Croft pleasantly, "for if Miss Elliot were to hear how soon we came to an understanding, she would never be persuaded that we could be happy together. I had known you by character, however, long before." "Well, and I had heard of you. Well, and I had heard of you as a very pretty girl. And what were we to wait for besides? I do not like having such things so long in hand. I wish Frederick would spread a little more canvas, and bring us home one of these fine young ladies to Kellynch. Then there would always be company for them, and very nice young ladies they both are. I hardly know one from the other." "Very good-humored, unaffected girls indeed," said Mrs. Croft, in a tone of calmer praise, such as made Anne suspect that her keener powers might not consider either of them as quite worthy as her brother. "In a very respectable family. One cannot be connected with better people. My dear Admiral, that post. We shall certainly take that post." But by coolly giving the reins of better direction herself, they happily passed the danger, and by once afterwards judiciously putting out her hand, and neither fell into a rut, nor ran foul of a dung-cart, and Anne, with some amusement at their style of driving, which she imagined no bad representation of the general guidance of their affairs, found herself safely deposited by them at the cottage. Alrighty. I'm probably going to call it there for today. Where do I think this is going? I wonder what said that I can't believe Henrietta's given up on Wentworth, so I wonder what said that gave Charles Hayter so much hope and optimism and made them get along so well there. And Anne seems confident Frederick isn't after Louisa. But she doesn't seem to know what Colonel, was it Wentworth, is after yet, though. I mean, it's telling my guess tells it's Anne herself. She just is blind to it still. Well, what's his game? Why is he trying to gauge her interest still? Since she turned him down last time? We'll see. All right. You found this. I appreciate your watching and hope you enjoyed.